So in lesson 9, we're going to do our right triangle proportions with the altitude and work on redrawing our pictures to set up our three corresponding or three similar triangles. So the first thing I'm going to say about this one is that none of these answer choices are actually correct. So we're just going to pretend that this is not a multiple choice question. In the diagram of triangle DEF, an altitude from right angle DFE has been drawn to DE. If DG is 8 and GE is 16, then what is the length of FG? Now again, I like to put all my numbers in my picture before I redraw them, because then otherwise I would never recognize the overall hypotenuse of the big triangle to be 24 without seeing them that way. So I like to redraw my first picture, or my big triangle, first. Now I'm going to keep that facing the same direction. As I go to draw my medium triangle now, I'm first going to notice what's the reflexive angle. So I see that the big triangle and the medium triangle here share angle E. So I know my E's have to be in the same exact spot. And then I said, okay, well, I put my right angle in the bottom left. So what letter represents the right angle of that medium one? And that would be G. So there's only one letter left there, so the F's got to go up top. And then I follow the same pattern with my small triangle. I say, all right, well, what letter is the reflexive angle between the big one and the little one? And that would be D. Well, since D was on the top, D's got to go on the top. And the right angle of the little one is also G. And then there's only one letter left, and that's where the F goes. So now I'm going to plug in my numbers. So I have an 8 on DG. I have an X on FG, and there happens to be two of those. I have a 16 on GE. I have a 24 on DE. So we have all three triangles, and we obviously can't set up a proportion between all three. So what we do is we find the ones that match. The big triangle is useless to us because there's only one side labeled. So then we're going to set up a proportion between the other two triangles. So 8 over x equals x over 16. When you cross multiply and solve, 8 times 16 gives you 128. We'll square root both sides. 128 is not a perfect square, but it splits into square root 64, square root 2, and that comes back together to give us a value of 8 square root 2. In the second one, in the diagram of triangle MNP, the segments MN and NQ are perpendicular. So that just tells us we have our right angle there, which forms our similar triangles. If MP is 24 and QP is 6, so obviously not drawn to scale, what's the length of NP? So we know that we can fill in MQ as 18 here. We can just do 24 minus 6. But now what we're going to do is we got to redraw our triangles. I don't like the way the triangle's facing, so I'm going to rotate my big one around so that it looks like this. You could keep them facing the same direction, but ultimately it's up to you. Now I'm going to focus on the triangle on the right. I'm going to call that my medium one. Well, my right angle's a Q, so I know where that's got to go. And then between the big one and the one on the right, the reflexive angle is the P. So I know P has to go up top, and then the only other letter left there is the N. So I go over to my smaller triangle. The right angle is still Q. And then what's the reflexive between the big and the little? That would be the M. So I put the M in the bottom right, so M's got to go bottom right, and the only letter left is the N. So now I'm going to plug in all my numbers. I've got an 18 for MQ. I've got a 6 for QP. I have an X for NP. I have multiple NPs. And then I have a 24 for MP. So as I look, my little triangle only has one side labeled, so that's going to be our useless one. So I look here, I can go 6 over x equals x over 24. Cross multiply, x squared equals, and 6 times 24 gives us 144. Take the square root, that's a good one because it's a perfect square, and we get 12. So now it wants us to use the answer in number 2 to determine the length of MN in simplest radical form. Now, you could just put a new letter on MN, and you could try to create a proportion to solve. But if you did that, you would notice that there is no corresponding side with that 18. So you'd have to do a little bit of work. So the way I look at it is, well, if I were to redraw my big triangle here, P, N, M, I have a 24. I just found PN to be 12. So now if I want to go here, well, I have two sides of a right triangle. I can use Pythagorean theorem. So y squared plus 12 squared equals 24 squared. 12 squared is 144. 24 squared is 576. I'll subtract the 144 on both sides, and I get y squared equals 432. We're going to take the square root of both sides, and what you'll notice is you don't get a perfect square. So now we have to split it. The biggest perfect square that goes into 432 is 144, and that's going to be multiplied by 3. So then y would come back together to be 12 square root 3. And then the last one, if the altitude drawn to the hypotenuse of right triangle EFG partitions it into two segment lengths 8 and 10, then find the length of the longer leg in triangle EFG in simplest radical form. So we're going to draw a triangle EFG. I'm going to draw it a little bit bigger here. So they didn't tell us where each letter goes, so I'm just going to put E, F, and G. So if they're going to draw the altitude, I'm going to make my right angle at F. So now if we're going to draw that altitude, that's going to come down just like that. And it partitions it in two segments, 8 and 10. They want us to find the longer leg of that triangle. Well, in this case, that's going to be FG because it's going to be on the side of the 10. So the one thing I can do before I move on is I can add the 10 and the 18, the 8 and the 10 to get 18. And now I'm in a situation where I'm going to take a little bit of time to redraw my triangles. So I'm going to choose to draw my big one. I'll put that F in the bottom corner. I'll put my E and my G. So now I'm going to redraw the triangle on the right. The right angle occurs at, now we need to create a letter for that piece. So I'm just going to create a letter, EFG, we'll call it H since that comes next. So H is my right angle. So I know that goes there. The reflexive angle between those two is the G, so that has to go on top. And then the only letter left for the bottom is the F. In my smaller triangle, H is still my right angle. The reflexive between the small one and the big one is the E. So I put the E in the bottom right, so E goes bottom right, and then F's got to go on the top. Now I start filling in my letters. FG is X. There's two of those. HG is 10, and HE is 8. So just like before, that smaller triangle here is useless to us. Oh, and I forgot to fill in the EG was 18. Smaller, useless, so we're going to use medium and big. So 10 over x equals x over 18. We cross multiply, x squared equals 180. We're going to square root both sides. 180 is not a perfect square, but the biggest perfect square that goes into it is 36. So square root 36, square root 5. So it comes back together to give us 6 square root of 5. So you can see that when you're able, I know it takes time, but when you're able to separate your triangles and make them match and face the same direction, then you can easily set up your proportions.